Good morning, everyone. Today is Monday, and Monday is the day that I remind you of the truth of Master's statement: every good, noble, or philanthropic enterprise sooner or later comes down to a matter of money. So here we are doing what we lovingly call the mission of the Masters, which primarily means the broadcasts and the recordings that I do, but it's also expanding out into a few other areas having to do with Swami's publications, making audio books of some of his writings, books that he didn't record, pulling a few other voices into that. And all of that has been made possible because of your generosity and your enthusiasm for supporting everything that we're doing, trying to spread the teachings of Master and Swamiji into the world. If you read the newspaper at all, which I don't advise, or look at the headlines anywhere, which I don't advise, except for a small necessity just to keep up with the world, the shadow force is really gaining a lot of power. And those of us who are committed to the light need to keep on doing everything we can do to keep real positive alternatives for how to be a human being in front of people. So if you feel to help this mission of the Master, spreading these wonderful teachings in every creative way that we can think of, please go to the Patreon website where you can subscribe and donate on a regular basis, or go to Asha Joy, which is my personal website, and you'll find ways to donate on an intermittent basis if you prefer. And just for fun, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, I don't think we've quite broken the 10,000 mark, and I would really like to, for no reason except that it's just a much more euphonic number than 9,892 or whatever the number is at this point. So we're really close, and more subscribers on YouTube gives you certain advantages, which quite simply put this message in front of more people. And that's exactly our plan. One by one by one by one, to help awaken people to the light. That was the mission of the Masters. So let us pray now and begin. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us with the awakening power of your presence, that when we look out on this mundane world, that it not look mundane to us at all. Help us to see your loving hand, your shining presence, your unconditional love behind every manifested form, that we may feel the truth of our own beings, that we are not alone, that we are not separate, that you are always with us. Om. Peace. Amen. So we are continuing with how to work with people, the art of supportive leadership. We're in this most interesting chapter, which is leadership is intuition and common sense. I think that's how I'm spinning here trying to find the exact title. Pretty sure that's it. Leadership is intuition guided by common sense. So we've made it through intuition, and now we're up to common sense, and then we're going to find out how they weave together. Swami says, the purpose of common sense is to test the claims of enthusiasm, but certainly not to squelch them. I want to spend a minute on that. How many of us have been absolutely sunk by our enthusiasm? You wouldn't think that enthusiasm would be a negative thing. Swamiji has said nothing great is ever achieved without enthusiasm. Swami himself, toward the end of his life, in fact, this letter that he wrote like literally a month before he left his body when he was in his late 80s, he said the characteristic feature of his personality had always been enthusiasm. And he was talking about how to his own puzzlement, he'd suddenly lost all his enthusiasm. He just had enthusiasm for nothing. What he was actually experiencing was vairagya. And vairagya is this wonderful Sanskrit word, which means disinclination. Disinclination primarily, quote, for the things of this world. But what had happened to Swamiji by the last weeks of his life, he had simply a disinclination for physical incarnation. He had been and was to the very last completely surrendered to Master, to his Guru. Whatever was needed of him, that he would do. But his own capacity to be enthusiastic about that was leaving him, and he was somewhat puzzled by it. He just put it out in a very honest way as a source of puzzlement. Of course, less than a month later, I think, he was gone from this world, so it was the natural withdrawal of energy before his departure, actually. But the fact that he said the salient characteristic of his personality was enthusiasm, when I think back over the many years of living and working with Swamiji, and I also think of the times when people were attacking him, just character assassination, just your general everyday character assassination, which was a natural part of his life. He had a conversation once with Peter Caddy, who was the founder of the Findhorn community. Actually, recently, there was a huge fire at Findhorn and one of their major buildings was burned down. Back in the 70s, 1978 actually, one of their main buildings was burned also. And it was arson the first time. It might have been arson this time, I'm not sure, but it was arson at that point. And when Peter Caddy came to visit America, because their community's in Scotland, and he came to see Swami Kriyananda at his house. I was there. And Swamiji expressed sympathy for Peter for the fact that somebody had actually burned down their temple. And they'd both men had built the communities from the ground up, so they really understood what it was to have a major building destroyed like that, what a setback, especially at that stage of the work. And Peter was completely cheerful about it. And he said, if they're not persecuting you, you're not putting out enough light, you're not working hard enough to put positive energy into this world, because if you are, then naturally the shadow force will see you as a threat, and they'll try to squelch you. So he felt that the fact that someone had arsoned their temple was kind of a good sign. I mean, he was putting a bright face on it because it was also a challenge, but he was putting a bright face on it. And that was in the context of Ananda was undergoing a little bit of persecution at that time, very tiny by comparison, I mean, minuscule by comparison. But the constant sort of yapping at your heels by people who don't want you to be doing what you're doing. It's like, really, get a life. It's like, what is your job? To try to stop other people's lives? You should be thinking positive in what you're trying to do. But in any case, so let me just go back to where I was. I was talking about enthusiasm. So when Swami was being your ordinary persecution, that's what I was talking about, because he was a tremendous light force, so a lot of shadow force tried to stop him. They challenged his leadership, accusing him of being dictatorial and all these things that you sort of do. There was actually a lawsuit filed against Ananda and Swami, and it was by this lawyer who basically, his career, he called himself a cult buster. That was his career. That was like his little subtitle, attorney, cult buster. And he liked to go around and find groups and attack them. He'd been hurt in some way in his life, and this was what he thought his duty was. So he had a boilerplate lawsuit, with all the different articles, and it just would go through the litany of, what could I say, against a charismatic leader? Well, financial mismanagement, abuse of people, sexual misconduct, dictatorial methods, self-aggrandizement at the cost of others. It was just all in legalese. And so he just filed it. And he didn't proofread carefully enough. So actually, the name of someone else and another group was also a couple of times in the lawsuit. He just picked it up from things he did before and then put it out on us. It wasn't funny at all. It's very funny now, but it was horrible at the time. But nonetheless, there you are. That was the adventure we had. But in all that, because I often had to speak, and I won't even call it in defense of Swamiji, just in explanation. Just like, well, this is what's said, and this is what I've experienced. The reason I said I did defend Swami fiercely, but my point was just to put forward what it was true. And I didn't try to persuade people, because if you can persuade people of one thing today, then somebody more articulate than you will persuade them tomorrow. You have to inform and then allow people to use their own, how about intuition and common sense to figure it out. But in all of that, I really began to understand that Swami had led by enthusiasm. And I knew it at the time, but it was a very interesting way to think about it. He was so enthusiastic about serving Master. He was so enthusiastic about helping people, about building a beautiful community, about doing something innovative, about just creative work in general, about music and artistic endeavors and pioneering new ways of doing things. And he was just so happy to be doing it. That's what enthusiasm is, isn't it? It's just like, it's not like it's an arduous strain. This is what I should do. This is what I have to do. No, this is what I want to do. And I want to do it because it makes me happy to do it. And the simple truth was, living with Swamiji, living at Ananda, it was so much fun. It was just like impossible to think about going anywhere else and doing anything else, because it would just be so boring. And that was how he did it. He never asked us to follow him. He never made any rules about what we had to do. He never exerted authority in the name of, I am the authority. None. Zero. He was just having a great time and opening the door and allowing us to sort of ride the wave of his enthusiasm until it became our enthusiasm too. One of the secrets of leadership is that one should be very enthusiastic about what you're doing, have lots of fun doing it, so that people will want to be with you. In other words, to be magnetic. It has to be fun, or people won't do it. It's just like you can make them do it out of fear or duty or something, but your enterprise won't thrive. The reason people will really stick with you, and there's been a huge core of people who've been with Ananda and with Swami for 40 and 50 years. I have a very large peer group of people who've had the same experience. And we've just done it because we just couldn't, in this whole wide world, we couldn't think of anything that was more fun than this because of his enthusiasm. So now we're going to talk about the balance of enthusiasm with common sense. I've gotten myself in trouble on quite a few occasions because I'm also a very enthusiastic person, and sometimes I get carried away by my enthusiasm. A friend of mine who was a very good businessman, let's see, Swami Kriyananda went to Australia on a lecture tour, and he came back with a whole lot of opals, beautiful opals, just the stones, unset. Master had collected opals. Opals are sort of milky, and then they have all this beautiful flashing color in them. Opals are, especially beautiful opals, are just stunningly beautiful. And Master collected them. Master had a number of little collections. Swamiji said it was just to keep his mind, to give him something to focus on, to keep his mind on this plane of consciousness. He said it was as hard for a master to keep his mind down as it is for ours to bring ours up. When Sri Ramakrishna would go into his samadhi states, which he was an avatar in India who lived in the late 1800s. And he died just about the time Master was born. And when he would just drift, he was unable at times to refrain from having his consciousness just soar into a samadhi state. In fact, when his disciples said, "Oh, there's a festival happening in the next village, we could," Sri Ramakrishna lived in a temple that was on the banks of the Ganges, just near Calcutta. And they said, "Oh, we'll rent a boat and we'll all get on the boat and we'll float down the river and then we'll go to the village to the festival." Ramakrishna said, "Oh," he said, "that does sound wonderful." He said, "But as soon as I get to the village, probably as soon as I'm floating on the Ganges, I'll just go into samadhi and miss the whole thing." It's just not worth the trouble. So now, what was I going to say about, let me sort of reconstruct, why was I talking about him going into samadhi? Oh, Master. So Master collected opals, he collected antique canes, he collected umbrellas. He just did things that kept him focused on this world. When Ramakrishna would come out of his samadhi state, there it was, in order to get back into this world, he would ask for a glass of water, or actually he would smoke, I think a hookah, maybe a cigarette, but I think it was a hookah. He would ask for a smoke, which you would think, that's odd. But it was just to bring him back into his body, to bring him back into this world. We have no idea what the state of consciousness of these incarnated souls are. It's so different than us. So Master collected opals. Swami always loved anything that reminded him of the astral world. When Swami was a child, he said the astral world was more real to him than this world. And he vividly remembers covering a table with this very colorful cloth that his mother gave him. And he would just sit inside and look at the light through the colors of the fabric. And he said he would just go into an ecstatic state. So he loved opals because you could look into opals and you could see the astral light in it. So he comes back from Australia with this collection of opals, and my friend, who was a relative who lived outside of Ananda, had nothing to do with Ananda, but was very friendly toward this. And I was sort of an honorary daughter to him. He was a businessman with a bit of a businessman's attitude, and when Swami was donated money to buy a Navratna, a 9-gem bangle, Swami had one. He sold it in order to build Ananda, and this woman came who had great wealth, and she gave Swami what was $10,000 then, which was a lot of money, which now you could probably buy one stone, but anyway, she gave him $10,000 with which he bought a whole Navratna, a very decent Navratna. Let's see, is it the one he has? Well, he subsequently upgraded many of the stones, but I think it's essentially the same one. Yeah, he's just improved it. And so this man would go around to all the jewelers in Los Angeles and say, "My daughter's guru needs some jewels." That's how he put it. And then they helped him buy jewels. So when Swami came back with these opals, I called my friend and said, "What can we do?" And he said to me, as a successful businessman, "You should never go into business selling something you love too much." He said, because it distorts your idea of how much other people are going to love it. And it turned out to be completely predictive, because the opal business never made us very much money. I mean, he was going to make our fortune and build our retreat selling opals, but it wasn't meant to be. I don't know what happened to all those opals. For a long time, they sat in a glass case at Crystal Hermitage. There was sort of a little display of all these opals, and a few people bought them because they were beautiful, but it never went anywhere. All of that long thing was to talk about enthusiasm, that we get so excited about something that we lose the capacity to connect to objective reality. And we just think, because I love it, everyone will love it. Now, Swami was doing other things, but he was enthusiastic, and he was very enthusiastic about his opals. And with him, he wasn't so much carried away as he was often carrying out some other initiative for some other reason. But we need enthusiasm in order to make things work. But as Swami says, common sense helps us to test the claims of enthusiasm. Okay, I'm going to bring back all these opals. Do I have any connections for how to sell them? Do I really want to put all the energy into this business? I remember what happened with the opals. He tried to put a couple of other people into business doing it. That was how it was working. Sometimes you see what Swami would do is he would take on a project that he was hoping somebody else could carry on, partly for the sake of the project, but always for the sake of that person also. But the purpose of common sense is to test the claims of enthusiasm, but not to squelch them. You can see there you are, you're right on the balance line. Opals is a very unusual idea for us. It's not the normal thing that we do, so we don't want to say, oh, we don't know anything about the jewelry business, we just can't do that. Swami pushed us into many different fields that we knew nothing about, but we learned. And in learning, we also grew and learned about ourselves. But if enthusiasm is allowed to run without any check on it, common sense, without any check on it, then very odd things happen. I was involved I have a friend who was a very good businessman, and who was very successful in business. I wasn't involved in his business, but when I was trying to work out a different problem, my friend said to me, he said, I am very lucky in my business life. He said, because I have exactly the right business partner. He said, because left to my own devices, he said, I wouldn't be successful because I would become so enthusiastic about my ideas that I would expand and just basically, he said, I know my enthusiasm carries me away. And I have a business partner who just has that extra gene, my friend said, that he himself lacked, that could tell which ideas were the ones to follow. Exactly. And he was very successful. And he said he was successful because he had enthusiasm and his friend had common sense. And they both had a lot of intuition. But they could make it work together, and it was personified in the two of them. And what the problem was, I was working with someone else who had a lot of enthusiasm but less common sense. And I didn't know what to do. I just didn't know how to work it out. And that was when he was explaining it to me. He says, common sense is too often mistaken for the voice of doom. Oh no, it's never going to work. Generally, however, people who claim to represent the voice of reason are merely saying, we tried that, but it didn't work. Swamiji, he would always, it's very interesting once you get the phrase, we tried that, but it didn't work. Once you sort of have it in the back of your mind, you see it all the time. It's always reappearing. And I hear it in myself sometimes when people will present to me some idea, and I will remember that we tried that, but it didn't work. And I have to stop and ask myself, why didn't it work? Did it not work because we didn't have the right people, because it wasn't the right time, because we didn't carry it off in a proper way? Or did it not work because it's a fatally flawed, awful idea? But the tendency to contract whenever things don't go right, and then make that contraction a law, rather than actually being willing to look right into the circumstance and know exactly what took place. Well, these were the problems before. You see, common sense learns from experience. We tried that, it didn't work because we did it like this. So if you're going to propose doing exactly the same thing, you should at least consider the experience that we had. But if you have an answer to that, if you can tell me that times have changed. When I was traveling in the early 80s for 4 or 5 years, I lived at Ananda Village, but my work was essentially up and down the West Coast. And I would go out and give programs, doing exactly what I'm doing now, but as a circuit preacher. I would, just go in my little car up and down the coast. And I remember talking to Swamiji about different classes that I was giving, and I was telling him that one of the most popular classes I was giving was about the chakras. And Swami said, "Really?" Like that. "Yes, really." He said, "When I was out lecturing," he said, "I could never have talked about the chakras. People didn't have any idea what I was talking about." I said, "Well, sir, times have changed." And it wasn't, of course, that it wasn't an important topic. It's just 25 years had gone by. So oftentimes when I'm in the position I am and people present ideas to me, and they might not seem that good to me, but I have to stop and say, but times have changed. And I always remember that conversation with Swami. So yeah, he tried it, it didn't work, but that doesn't mean that when I try it, it won't work. And so common sense needs to not live in the past. It has to live in the present. It learns from the past, but it has to live in the present. Otherwise, it just becomes, as he says, it's the squelching energy. Common sense is the voice of doom, and you're trying to get some creative magnetism going, and somebody's just over there harping on all the problems. I've made this mistake, and I've had to think very carefully, because I tend to be, as Swami put it to me, very factual. Just he said something about negative energy from me. And I said, "Sir, really? I never think of myself that way." He said, "You're not really negative, but sometimes you're so," and then he said it like that, factual. Just like all these little details, as if they are the determining factor of success. So see, part of this is we have to understand where success comes from. Success comes from a dynamic flow of positive energy. But there's that fine line between positive energy and wishful thinking. And this is where common sense, rightly exercised, common sense comes in and it balances out what is positive energy and what is merely wishful thinking. Wishful thinking doesn't have the magnetism. Positive energy can often overcome many obstacles, but it's feet on the ground. The intuition comes, you can see the top of the mountain, but you have to know where your feet are, and you have to know what your next step is. You can't just sort of vaguely say, "Oh, well, it's so beautiful, it's going to work." Common sense, yes, but who's going to run the project? Who has the time? Who has the ability? And, can we really bring it out of them? What are the resources? And there's always a point where you just kind of step a little farther than you're certain of, but you're certain of your ability to meet what's coming. I was just, there comes something in you, which is not wishful thinking, but which is knowing that I have within me the intuitive resources, the divine resources that will give me what I need at the time I need it. Swamiji was very bold, but he was never reckless. He always, he expanded beyond the obvious. He never expanded beyond his own sense of energy to carry it, and he never risked too much. Even the opals, which didn't really turn out to be as lucrative as he had hoped, but he didn't put all his resources into the opals. He just took some, put them into the opals. Let's see what we can come. And if he didn't get all the money back for it, it was all right. It wasn't reckless. It was bold, but it wasn't reckless. This is how we are putting all our different energies together. Okay, my friend.